Steve, the panel is yours.
I think we have a clip. I'm Steve Clemons of Semafor, and I just want to say thank you to the organizers here. How many of you paid a lot of money for your ticket to get here? You are so lucky. Because, you know, the fact, I mean, it's just some of us paid so much. I mean, this is a great, great forum, a great conference. You should be charging, Slavo, to get people in here. So I just want to plant that idea because it is like getting a master class of free education in so many interesting ideas. So our job now, we've got this fantastic panel, the challenge of 2024, Europe and the potential shift in American foreign policy. You know, I want to just start out with one element of my own fear of this moment. After the invasion of Ukraine, the thing you heard over and over again is transatlantic relations are in a new renaissance. They have never been stronger, never been better. They've been revitalized. And I've been worried about two things. One, why did it take a shock like an invasion of a country to remind transatlantic allies why the relationship is so important? And the second thing is, we have something in American sports called a head fake. Is this moment a head fake? Are there fundamental structural problems in the relationship masked by this moment that we're not dealing with? And with that, and I think as we think about American politics, and I'm so sorry that we have to raise that issue here because it's complex, I deal with it every day, that as you think about the changes and shifts that may be coming along the way, you know, President Biden right now is in the G7 meeting, and you know he's not as robust and nimble as he used to be, and Donald Trump is as robust and as nimble as he used to be, and there are big questions coming about the choices Americans will make. But to that end, I want to start with really the European side of this and ask Tomasz, if you would, to help set the stage and tell us, how is Europe organized around its own identity as it looks at its key relationships? What are the tribes on the European side?
First, thank you, Steve. To answer quickly, as a former basketball player, I know what a head fake is. So I don't think it's a head fake. I think there's a strategic change, and that change plays towards, not away from, that connection. What it takes. There
will be a nightcap tonight, head fake or not.
Yes, well,
Kleine-Brockhoff versus Clemons.
You'll rename it. The second answer to your first question is also quite simple. We've had it too good. You know, why did it need that? Because we had it too good. But that was not your question to me.
Right.
I just felt I should help you with your own setup. So what's the European setup? I think the first to start out with, we should acknowledge that there is a challenge. And that challenge is a potential seminal change in the foundations of U.S. foreign policy, and that goes beyond a man who says he'll end the war in 24 hours and has as a foreign policy platform, and I quote, preventing World War III.
Right.
End quote. So that goes beyond that, and our title says we're about the 2024 challenge. We should add to that the 2027 challenge. That would be the French election, and Marine Le Pen anteport us, because if you have the combination of these challenges, that also influences and precludes some of the ways out of this then potential mess. But you asked about the tribes.
Right.
I think the tribes that we're looking at are the two Europes that we've been discussing for a number of years now, but they're sort of coming to a head prior to 2024, and that's the debate between Euro-Gaulists and Euro-Atlanticists. We all have had quite our dose of debates about European sovereignty and autonomy and all of that. We've understood that there is different concepts of what a future of Europe should look like. And they come to a head in 2024 of who sort of wins this game. And the starting point, I think, for the Europe goal list is the analyses that the United States is going to be an increasingly unpredictable, also maybe unreliable, maybe inward-looking or China-facing, one of the two, a partner, and the consequence to that, at least to the sort of the French-led school, is European sovereignty. And the problem with that, of course, is that it's not just about European capacity, European capability. It's also about a European position, as Mr. Macron has told us in his latest visit to China, somewhere in the middle, in equidistance to the other poles, in trying to establish not a Western but a European axis and pole of power as a consequence of that American challenge. So the Euro-Atlanticists, on the other hand, I think are basing their future assessment on the fact that the United States, certainly more than ever through the war, have an enduring and a strategic, not just a tactical interest in Europe. Self-interest. It's not about saving Europe from itself or saving Europe from Russia. It's an American interest, and that American interest is important enough to stay involved. And I think the war has told us a story about that interest. That interest, of course, is connected in some way to the China challenge. I think Andrew Majda, who was in the audience, has said it well. You cannot convince one set of allies that we're going to be with you as America when you're just leaving another set of allies in the sand. So there is some connection between the two, whether it's single theater or something that connects them is to be debated, but it constitutes an enduring interest, but it is an interest that we as Europeans, I think to cut it short, I think we need something that is a new transatlantic bargain that is geared to this moment and is geared to this challenge.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think it's great that you describe these two dives, and Majda, I want to jump to you, and I'm going to do it in a funny way. But to get it, it really asks the question: is are Europe's choices and Europe as it sees it defined by what happens in the U.S., or do they go a separate way? I mean, does 2024, does 2027, react to that? So one is a function of the other. But the second part of it is, I was with Senator Joe Manchin at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he was being attacked over what was called the Inflation Reduction Act being a protectionist measure, and he said, look, the only thing protectionist about the IRA is us Americans protecting you Europeans. And he laid down something which I think is very interesting, which is in the minds of some Americans, whether you agree with Manchin or not, they see, rightly or wrongly, European security as something America is giving, and there ought to be a quid pro quo for something it's getting. And when I heard Bruno Le Maire, the French finance minister, when I heard Robert Habeck from Germany come over trying to lobby for a different view, something with more of an equality and equals, it just showed me, even in this late day, such instability in the way Europeans and Americans are looking at each other, even before we get to questions of what happens with Donald Trump. But Majda, help us with this.
Hello, I wasn't sure the microphone was on. So perhaps to pick up on the question, are Europe's choices defined by what happens in the US? And I think, yes, they are. At least as long as we do not have sufficient capabilities to take care of our neighborhood to the east, to the south, and the Western Balkans. But it goes far beyond that. And perhaps to start with the scenarios, I mean, obviously we're talking about the US elections, what's going to happen in 2024. There's so many moving targets. Right. We don't even know who the Republican primary candidate is nominee is going to be. There's uncertainty related to Joe Biden's health and age and Trump's legal status. So how do we make sense of what's going to happen? How do we prepare? Because in Europe, that is what this all about. How do we prepare for 2024? And I think we can start by preparing on the basis of the things that we do know. And what is it that we do know is the shifts in the US foreign policy, which are structural and bipartisan, and which are going to happen, and we need to be facing no matter who wins. And these, I would say, are three major areas. You've brought up the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, there is a growing consensus between the parties, bipartisan convergence on kind of rejection of the free trade doctrine and the kind of economic national pivot towards reshoring and strengthening production capacities at home. We have deprioritizing of the Middle East over a couple of administrations, starting with Obama over Trump to Biden. It's a region in which Europeans are going to have to pick up the pieces as US retrenches. And then we have the growing bipartisan consensus on China, especially on the strategic rivalry and the need for a strategic industrial policy which Europeans will absolutely have to respond to one way or another. So yes, I would say we're constantly in a responsive mode.
Well, I think the responsibility there, I'm going to ask all of you in a minute, and Tomasz, we're going to get to you in a second. Bruno, everybody, feel free to jump in on this. But, I think one of the other big questions of the moment is as you look at Europe's choices and where it's going and how it looks at its defense. Fiona Hill last week in Tallinn, Estonia, gave this pretty remarkable speech about the failure of U.S. foreign policy, and that the tectonics that we see today of worrying about Donald Trump are actually decades old, that we had many, many other preceding moments. And she actually said Osama bin Laden was essentially right, that America would overreact, make this, and we've been basically bouncing back and forth, and that we have a fatigued nation, particularly with national security and defense, that feels as if being engaged in the world benefits China more than it benefits the American middle class. So I'm just interested in those tectonic dimensions, that are we getting something wrong here, that we think that reacting a certain way in Ukraine is going to fix. She said, essentially, Ukraine and the conflict there would not have happened if there were not a perception of U.S. strategic contraction in the world. So where are you on that, Majda, and then Bruno?
Well, I mean, definitely, if you look at 12 years ago, Bob Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense both under Bush and Obama, held a speech about the U.S. fatigue, exhaustion after the decade of wars. And I mean, if you listen to that speech, that could have been delivered in 2023. And it was delivered before the seizure of Crimea. It was delivered in the context of Libya intervention when the Allies ran out of bombs or ammunition after 11 weeks. And when it became clear that the Europeans cannot sustain their efforts without constant infusion of American assistance. So I absolutely agree, they are tectonic. And not only, I would say, not only focused on the burden sharing and the need for Europeans to step up, but many other issues as well.
Bruno?
Well, I think the crisis in Ukraine is connected to the retraction of American power. Not so much Afghanistan. The more we learn about how the war was prepared in the Kremlin, the more we realize it was being prepared a few months before Afghanistan. But the inability that we found to project economic power in Russia, I think it surprised us how incompetent the military operation was, but I think it also surprised us how resilient the Russian economy turned out to be. And I think that wouldn't have been the case a decade ago, that you'd have a run on the banks, a financial collapse, and none of that happened. Russia was able to develop structures that are relatively self-contained. And also our inability to to influence Russian society. There are no liberals left in Russia. There's no one that looks up to the West. So that, I think, signals a retraction of American power in general, and it was a signal to the Kremlin that they could be bolder. Another element you're seeing of that retraction is, this transatlantic agreement used to be implicit. We all agreed, didn't have to discuss it very much. And now it's becoming very explicit. The examples you gave, let's put it on a sort of a counting table on both sides. And that's always dangerous when a relationship becomes transactional. And we have actually to ask, inconvenient as the question is, whether the transatlantic relationship is becoming to some extent transactional, particularly in Washington. That's what we hear. I think the US gets a lot out of this relationship. I follow very closely for 10 years regulation in Brussels, and we always choose a very soft touch towards American companies, particularly the internet companies. And why is that? We're dependent on American security, we're partners, and I wish people in Washington realize this, that this is not just one-sided. It plays both ways. There's a bit of a danger of European isolationism, not American isolationism anymore. When we talk about Taiwan, I think we'll talk about this. But if Europeans get convinced that the Russian threat has disappeared, the temptation will be to say, well, we're safe now. The US has its confrontation with China. We support it in principle, but we're not going to be fully committed to it. So actually, I think the danger now is more of European isolationism than American isolationism.
European isolation. Tomasz, where are you on European isolation? Let me ask you, as you think about this, because you sit and live here in Poland, and I love coming to Poland because you get a different feel for Europe here than when you're in Paris or you're in Berlin. When you move westward, the tone changes, right? There's a little bit more relaxed sensibility of these kind of big equities involved in foreign affairs and whatnot. But the intensity, if you're in the Balkans, if you're in the Baltics, if you're in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, is much more intense, is my impression. Am I wrong? And what does that say about your fellow Europeans and their seriousness?
Well, once a week I'm in Brussels, so I'm.
How's that going for you?
Jumping on a plane, I'm in different planet. I'm going to European institutions, and language changes not just from Polish to English, but completely different narrative. So yes, Europe is going in completely different setup, and I think as much as we discuss about American isolation, about American going through some contraction, we do that every 20 years. Every 20 years, we see some internal problems in the US, and then how it is going to affect external politics, and whether they're going to withdraw from Europe or not. And at the end, everything comes out the same. So we talk a lot about it, but we don't see on numbers. I mean, we have at the Warsaw Enterprise Institute this index of wealth of nations, and we put how much you get back if you put, let's say, $100 into private business in Poland, in Italy, and any European or the US, and in public sector. And US is high fly. It's always coming top. If you look, if you compare data, GDP on G7, in 1990, US was 40% of GDP. Now it's 58%. If you look at dollar where it is, where you look at the investment, American investment in finances in Europe are going up. American companies, cyber companies are just a king. I mean, you don't have Polish Amazon, you don't have French Amazon, you don't have Italian Google or so on. This is run. Why Europe is coming up with all those ideas about digital regulations? To stop Americans to take over everything, because they don't have a capacity to run their own comparative business. And now President Macron comes out and says that he is fighting for sovereignty of Europe. And if you're going to Brussels, you have to hear it twice, because he says sovereignty from China and from the US. So we want to be sovereign from the US. So what is exactly he's talking? He's not talking to be Europe will be strong. independent, with a free market, with very good tax system, with better schools. No, he's saying that will bring a lot of protectionist barriers, a lot of new regulations, and will make Americans pay. What are they paying for? They're paying for access to 400 million people to access the market. Europeans can't compete on digital, they can't compete on mass production, they are on chemical, their laws are stringent, that they can't help their own companies.
Right.
So what they're doing, they're selling access to their own people. This is the biggest resource of EU. So if nothing changes in the US policies, if America will become more like Europe, be more overregulated, the policies will be even more redistribution. Europe will be closing up in this bubble of the social protectionism, and the role will be diminishing. So what I believe that the only chance and hope for Europe is America will be more American, more competitive, and we'll see more European companies want to go to the US. All these rich people. And
well, that's what the IRA is about, right?
Yes, exactly. And so
you're blocked unless you come in.
What will be response from Europe? More protections? No, they'll have to liberate the market. They have to come with a new, better tax system and internally change.
I need you to come to America because it's the rosiest picture of America that I've heard in a long time about we're all worried about the reserve currency status of the dollar. We're worried about, another bubble in the system. We're basically waiting for the sky to fall again, and you see it, high up there. But that's
well, the distance makes that. Yeah. That's why we look better from the U.S. From here, from Warsaw perspective.
But go ahead, Tom. Someone jump in. But I mean, on this broad side of when you look at where the direction may come, let's posit for a minute that Donald Trump wins in 2024. It looks like that right now that's a big possibility. He is by a major poll ahead of Joe Biden right now. If the election were held tomorrow, Donald Trump would win in the United States against Joe Biden. And that's a remarkable thing to be saying because it presumes that independents are breaking Trump's way more than they would be breaking Biden's way in this moment, despite legal judgments against him that are pretty significant. One involving harassing and defaming and abusing, sexually abusing a woman, which is a sensitive subject. So in that environment, he made very clear. I remember when President Trump came in, and I said this not as a derogatory thing, but just as a statement of fact. When he was first elected, the Japanese asked me, "What do you think is going to happen?" I said, "He's going to shake down his friends, and shake them down, like you would offer want protection money." And essentially, I'm just interested in how Europe responds to that possibility of Donald Trump responding. And I don't think it necessarily ends the relationship, but is Europe ready to fall in line to be shaken down again as the price of security?
Steve, allow me to, before I answer that question, and I will, to ponder a little bit that thought that Bruno just had on European isolationism. I don't think I've heard that before, so that's a new concept to be European isolation. And I wonder whether it's already the precise term. It's an open question to me.
Right.
Is it in the end what the Indian foreign minister now famously said, Jaishankar, the Europeans believe that a European problem is the world's problem, but the Europeans don't believe that the world's problems are Europe's problems. That it's more self-absorption rather than isolationism, or self-importance maybe, as a historical memory of an imperial past, rather than an isolation. And the question really is whether the economic globalization that we're so good at, we're also ready for geopolitical globalization. Australia, since the beginning of the war, has sent, I think, one plane a week in military equipment to Ukraine. It's not really a neighboring country. So I think they're also trying to make a point. If we were asked to do the same thing, and I'll just say Taiwan, are we Europeans ready to do that? And is that isolationism that drives our reluctance, or our inability to sort of accept global systemic competition? And the last person who denied that was Mr. Macron in China.
Right.
So that it's an open question. I'd love to hear your thought on it, Bruno. But point one. But your question was about are we ready for Trump? I don't think anybody is ready for Trump too. And you should have a number of.
But you should be thinking.
You should be thinking about it. You would wonder how many planning staffs should sit around.
And let's just say for a minute, it could be Ron DeSantis. It could be any number of other people who, I think it's a mistake sometimes to get wrapped around a single individual and rather look at the tectonics that got us that person.
I would counter you on that one. There is a fundamental difference between anybody who has a sort of, talks about the retraction of America and has a different view of America's role in the world, and Donald Trump. Donald Trump is sui generis as somebody who has attempted a coup and steal an election. So I don't think that's, I think we should make a strict difference between America's desire to have a different foreign policy and Donald Trump. He may be part of that movement, but as a president, he is structurally different, and we should and will take account of that difference. I think Donald Trump, too, will be very different than Donald Trump 1. He will have learned the traits. He will not have sort of the adults in the room, the people who try to cater to him but keep things in check. That won't happen. He will have learned to play the system, and his foreign policy, as you can see from even the mini remarks that he made to World War III, preventing World War III, will be very different. And we should have very warm clothes here. And I don't think anybody is ready for that. I don't think anybody is planning for it. But it is also the case that I at least cannot see in Western Europe that people would be trying to sit this one out. This would change the balance of the debate between the Euro-Atlanticists and the Euro-Gaulists in dramatic ways.
Where I disagree with you respectfully is that this notion that America's getting a bad deal in the rest of the world is a strong one that's growing in the Republican Party beyond Donald Trump, that it's there. And Majda, you wrote a really interesting article recently on the three tribes among Republicans, three different kinds of Republicans as you look forward, and looked at them with regards to what the consequences would be depending on which one of these tribes was ascendant. My worry is that the kind of nativism, the narcissism, and the, it's really a kind of isolationism growing, on the U.S. side, Bruno, is there, and we see it with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene is no longer fringe. She is very key in key places of power and has a bigger sound box now and able to kind of raise questions about every dollar that goes to Ukraine. So it just puts you in a situation thinking there may be these splits in Republicans that Democrats are actually unwilling to step forward. They've got their own divides, but tell us about the three tribes.
So basically, perhaps not to take too long to elaborate on each one of them, maybe to sum it up, we have a number of commonalities across the party regardless of which tribe may end up influencing the foreign policy agenda of the next president. And I think this is something, again, that we should be preparing for. So no matter whether it's DeSantis, whether it's Trump, or somehow miraculously, Nikki Haley or former Vice President Pence.
So Nikki Haley would be a miracle for you.
That would be a miracle if they merged up from the kind of super low single digits. I would be very surprised. But let's just kind of, for now, say things can happen.
Right.
And so we have actually all three tribes represented in the spectrum of candidates. The way we looked at them is really based on the difference of how they see America's global posture and how they see America's role in the world in terms of its military deployment and capacities. And so you go from the spectrum of hardcore restrainers that we're all familiar with, who are in minorities, like Senator Mike Lee from Utah or Rand Paul from Kentucky, to then this whole inner circle, in fact, around Donald Trump, who continue to be influencers in the MAGA circle, such as Rick Grinnell, such as Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon. And they have added a really powerful voice to the restrainer camp, where they claim, and this is where the kind of whole projection of grievances goes on the allies in Europe, where they claim that it's not America's job to defend wealthy nations in Europe who have in any case loop-sided the commercial agreements, taken advantage of America's security guarantees, etc. And so next to it and very close to it, and you know, it's not so neat, so people are shifting between, are the China prioritizers, who, to sum it up, basically think that the only way to make it until the end of this decade without Chinese invasion of Taiwan is to move heaven and earth to arm Taiwan to its teeth and to deter the potential invasion, and that needs to start yesterday. And so in their view, assistance to Ukraine is in a direct conflict with the needs to change the military balance in Asia and Taiwan. They do not believe in the value of integrated deterrence. And so that is a very clear, again, a minority, but a very vocal minority. And then you have a group that we know from the kind of traditional Republican internationalist position, and we've named them primacists, and they include the likes of Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, former President Vice Pence, Bolton, etc.
Kind of along the transatlanticist that Tomasz was talking about.
Kind of this, in fact, what's shared by most people here, the notion that America can and should maintain global posture, and that it needs to kind of maintain strong deterrence, not just in Asia, but also Middle East and Europe, etc. And so I think, you know, depending what I see from the debates, the fact is that what we like to see as Europeans or like to hear is mostly coming from the congressional elites, such the likes of Mitch McConnell and the primacists. But the two frontrunners in the primaries, in fact, take a very different position on Ukraine. And I think this is something where, you know, it's not something I like, but this is, I think, something that we seriously need to take into account and prepare for. And just one final note on Trump, sorry. David Frum has written the second book as Trump's first term was ending, called Trumpocalypse. I think it's a great great description of what might happen. And he has in there one brilliant remark, and he says Trump's concept of the relationship between the nations is very simple. It's either you're a predator or you're prey. And it's all about getting even and getting, obviously, better deals. Now, I think if we apply that...
Short form.
Yeah. No, I just think the Trumpocalypse is actually a very good term, because it is going to introduce a whole different level of uncertainty of US commitment to defense of allies, not only Ukraine, not only Europe, but also Taiwan. And I think that Chinese hegemony in Asia is probably more likely under a scenario of Trump than other Republicans.
So Bruno, if you were China and you were looking at a fatigued military, the long-term sort of strategic contraction of the US, a war that we didn't deter in Russia, or with Ukraine, you know, wouldn't you say it's a good time to invade Taiwan if you were going to invade Taiwan? I mean, aren't the global circumstances ripe to do it? Wouldn't you do it?
I don't think China will do it in the coming...
I mean, one of the questions I think is very important is to look at our own habits of mind that make us look at sort of these big shocks and unable to do it. I have never believed that China would disrupt its economic miracle, you know, to lifting hundreds of millions of people out of there, to basically take Taiwan forcefully, unless the global situation presented such a ripe situation that it was there. When you listen to Michael McCaul, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, say that we are so distracted in Ukraine. He's not complaining about it, but so many munitions, so many supplies. You look at global supplies that are flowing into Ukraine right now, and it's created this massive defense shortage. Many of you are defense experts. You know more about it, that we're underprepared to deal with kinetic conflict right now in Taiwan. That's number one. That's before you get to the second issue we talked about, which is kind of this sense of fatigue and dismay that the United States is out engaging deeply in a country that was not an ally, Ukraine, engaged in Taiwan, coming back to explain it to an American public that's been gut punched over and over and over again in the last few decades for various things. I mean, so it raises this interesting question that if you were Xi Jinping, wouldn't you think that this is a really ripe moment?
I think China will try other avenues first, and they're confident that they can make them work. I also think that it's not going to be an invasion. It's going to be something more ambiguous and more difficult for the U.S. to react to and to bring allies on board, perhaps a blockade. You know, if you look at Ukraine, I think Putin was successful in two things. Blockade of Ukrainian ports, it's easy to do. And he was successful also, in my opinion, with the nuclear threat.
Right.
And I think this is what Xi Jinping probably will do. They will try a more, you know, as a blockade, and then how does the U.S. react?
So stop there for a moment. Will Europe care?
That's right. I worry that he won't as much as the U.S. expects. When I read the comments by Macron coming back from China, my reaction was not that he is somehow triangulating or making some kind of equivalence between the U.S. and China. I saw it as a manifesto of European isolationism. He was trying to reduce expectations about Europe's responsibilities and essentially saying, we'll think about this. We don't like this confrontation. We'd like to tone it down. And we're perhaps even considering that if there's a conflict where we think the U.S. is responsible for triggering,
right,
then we might actually not be involved at all. So it's more about reducing Europe's responsibilities than equating the U.S. With China. Can I just say quickly something about Trump? Because really I think you're Steve, you're assuming that it's going to be relatively the same. I think it's going to be very different. So think about this scenario. Trump comes in. He tries to bring about that deal that he keeps talking about, a peace for land. And in that case, perhaps it's going to be people in Poland and Czechia that are going to be shocked with Trump. Last time around, there was some ability to work together with Trump. And it might be people in Berlin and Paris that are going to be behind Trump and saying, yes, let's do that. Let's have a deal. So it might look very different from the last time around. And people here should be getting ready for that.
I wouldn't disagree with that, actually. I mean, you know, I did a TV show this week with a guy named Jason Miller, who's Trump's, you know, spokesperson, and then also Bernie Sanders, head of his campaign when he ran. I had them on stage together. It was very civil. They had a great discussion, and you realized listening to them what a shared worldview they had of where the power was and the pockets to get within the American political base. And these are basically working class Americans, very frustrated with what's happened culturally. They are angry that they have been demeaned and left behind. I remember Joe Biden told me the Democratic Party had become a party of snobs. And I asked whether the snob problem in the Democratic Party had been fixed, and they both said no. So there's another dimension here that feeds into, it's a psychological dimension, that when you get involved then in conflicts and relationships, somehow that group of people have to find a space. And right now, it's not clear among strategic elites that they've figured that out, is my view. But Tomasz, what's your view? And how are you handling it in Poland? Do you have a strategic elite working class gap?
I think in Europe, we have several dimensions of division. It's not only either Atlantis or not. The war showed different also dimension narrative between West and Central Europe.
Right.
It is a lot of elements into it because it's also economic changes and a growing Central European countries, their strength, political strength, economic strength, and growth at the same time, diminishing influence and the position of Germany and German and Franco. composite. So this is another conflict which probably is not very well seen from other side of Atlantic.
Right.
But it's strong and growing. And you have to understand that some Central European countries, the use concept, which initially was kind of academic, political use for diplomacy, 3 Cs concept, it's now growing in people's minds. It is more and more popular, not just in diplomatic circles, but in average people. It's not about strategy only, but also to build our own say and something to the position of the interests of Central Europeans, because we felt that it's not Americans who really threaten Europe, but Germans, French, who pretty much sold out Ukraine.
That's a tweetable moment.
And so our conflict is not with Biden. It's not with Trump. And there's this feeling that now we are very well treated by Biden administration because they need Rzeszów, our cities on the border, to transport arms. But once things changed, and let's say war ends, the Biden administration will be as scornful to Poland as Germans and French are. They go back to the German-Franco commitment and will talk to Poland through Berlin, like they did before. And we are quite aware of it. So when you're saying that
the short form
Republicans are endangering the peace and our balance of power in Europe, we are not so sure, because we are looking already day after.
Okay, so let's go. I'm going to go 30-second answers here because I want to get at least one question from the audience. I'm sorry, folks, this was more interesting than I had thought it was going to be, and we went a little bit longer. But I mean, I think that right now we're in an interesting situation. I'm just going to be honest. I think many of us look skeptically at the candidacies of Joe Biden and of Donald Trump. We see several major legal challenges coming down for Donald Trump, and we don't know what happens. History is very hard to predict. If Jack Smith brings an indictment, if there's an indictment about meddling in the Georgia election, that could shift independence so substantially that the Republican Party can't win. So we don't know what. I remember when Hillary Clinton was 38 points ahead of Barack Obama in a primary, and nobody thought she was beatable. Guess what? Stuff changes. So you've got major legal issues coming down the pike, and the broader side is just on the table with Joe Biden is age, and we have a year and a half before this next, more than a year and a half before this next election. So I just want to ask real quick, short form, what if neither of the two candidates who've declared that they're running against each other actually are on the ticket? How does that look? Does that, from a European perspective, Tomasz, what if both parties in the United States, where does that become something to be optimistic about, or does that send shivers down the backs of leaders in Europe?
Are you seriously asking whether, if Donald Trump is not on the ticket, that would send down shivers?
Yeah. Come on. Well, and Joe Biden. But I mean, I think both, because I think what will happen is there'll be a civil war in both parties, and that all of the things we're talking about come out more raw, more real, more nasty. I actually think Donald Trump is a known quantity. I actually think it could be quite bad in both parties. So.
I don't think that would be, certainly where I come from, that wouldn't be the sense. The sigh of relief. Also, think of that Donald Trump. Right. Whatever else is happening, it's not Donald Trump. That would be relief.
Bruno?
I tend to agree with you that I think there are, and that changed in the last 4 or 6 years. There are now people in the Republican Party that I have more reservations about than I have about Donald Trump. Also, when it comes to relations with Europe, they are more radical, they are more ideological than Trump.
So not relieved. Majda?
It really depends who the alternative candidate would be on the Democratic side, because there's debates in that party as well. If we'd get someone closer to the realists or progressives, we also may see some shifts that come from different reasons ideologically, but also argue for greater restraint.
Some would say it would be Vice President Kamala Harris. Some would say that will never happen. That is the equation.
Well, it should, but I think in any case, regardless, again, going back, regardless who we have, there's certain inevitabilities that we absolutely need to prepare for as Europeans, and that is summed up.
Tomasz, 30 seconds.
Whatever you have in the US, we have equivalent in Poland, in most countries in Europe. Wait for the stream of elections in Europe, you'll be even more surprised, because I think we have the same polarization, radical environment. So I think we are talking about American politics because it's very nice
we need a Majda Ruge playbook for polarization. That would be a great article.
Yeah, but
great
Europe, I can assure you, would come up with new elections, and we saw it already in...
Okay, we're going to get one big question, one question right here, and I'm sorry that we're only going to take one, but so make it great. Is it going to be great? Okay, good. And tell us who you are. I should know, but yeah.
Benjamin Tallis, German Council on Foreign Relations, making questions great again.
Excellent.
Thanks very much for the great panel. I want to ask, it's two questions, but they're very short.
Yeah.
One is, in Berlin, a lot of people talk about the challenges of a Trump election victory. What are the challenges of a Biden election victory for Germany?
Good question.
And second, Bruno, I think you're totally right when talking about isolation and isolationism.
Right.
It is a mixture of self-obsession as well, but it's not European isolationism. Europe doesn't exist at the geostrategic level. There is a huge split in Europe, and Macron, pretending that this is a European position, is driving a further wedge into that split and making it worse. What do we do about that?
That's exactly Thomas's beginning point, too. So let me get Majda, you want to jump in on?
Well, maybe quickly on the challenges of the second Biden administration, starting with where we started off with. You know, Biden policy foreign policy for the middle class is in many senses, polite version of America First. So, you know, Afghanistan, AUKUS, what else was there? A third kind of slip? Oh, IRA, protectionism. I mean, all of the issues that we are already dealing with in a nicer and politer version. And I'd say possibly, if you look at the amount of the assistance to Ukraine, I'm not even sure it's going to stay at the same level under the Biden administration.
Thank you. Tomasz on Biden?
Same thing, free trade, IRA. Secondly, Benjamin, I think the closeness of the current Berlin government with the Biden administration will be a problem for them in a second Biden term, because they're going to have to adjust to a potentially different Biden too.
Let me get Tomasz on Biden, and then I'm going to have you take on that.
I think the accumulation of problems we have now in the US will be just greater, and the possibility of internal clashes or some kind of conflicts will be bigger, and this will be, I think, much bigger danger than some kind of Republican in the US, not necessarily Trump, but someone who kind of would change the mood of American politics will be better.
Bruno, you get the last word.
Benjamin, you're right that right now, you know, countries like Poland, Baltic states are very committed even to the Taiwan question. But, you know, that's why I raised the scenario where Trump comes in, drastically reduces the U.S.'s responsibilities towards Ukraine, and then everything could change. And then both sides could go down an isolationist path. I think there are dangers here.
Will you please give a round of applause to Tomasz Wróbewski, Majda Ruge, Bruno Maçães, and Tomasz Kleine-Brockhoff. Thank you very much for a great conversation. Thank you all. And I think we should make this session longer next year, okay? And that'd be great. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.